Okay, so let's take a look at some of the tools that we can use within the floor plan, and then we'll look at the site plan features. So here you can select the door and use these door controls here, these small arrows, to change the swing. You can also select here the wall, and in this type selector under properties, you can change the wall type. Here I'm going to change it to an interior 4 7/8 partition, 1 hour. At first you won't see the detailing of the drywall because at the very left corner there's a control here under the view control bar to change the view from coarse to medium and fine, and right now it's on coarse. If we change it to fine, you'll see that some lines appear, but because these are so bold, they're walls, and we're at 1/8 of an inch, which we'll change a little bit later, we can go to the View tab here at the top and pick Thin Lines so that you can see a little more detail to your drawing as we're close in view to an 1/8 inch scale. Notice when I have thin lines off and I zoom back, at an 1/8 inch it looks good. So it has to do with the zooming level and what scale you're plotting. If I turn thin lines off, all of the lines will display as a single width, and it gives us a little more control over viewing our lines. We'll come back to talk about thin lines more as we start to develop details. In the Annotate tab, we can use Aligned to place dimensions. I can pick this wall center line and this opening and place an aligned dimension. And now if I select that dimension, I can use this small control to click on it and change the dimension location. I also wanted to add that if you select here a door or an object and you have here a temporary dimension that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, we can click on this little witness line, and once you have the dimension that you need, and once you position where you want that dimension, you can click on the small linear dimension here underneath the text to turn the temporary dimensions into permanent ones. When I click here in space or use my escape key to end the command, then you'll see your dimension. And even then you can select it and use these little witness line controls to change the dimension location. These dimensions are based on an 1/8 inch floor plan. If I change at the bottom left corner my plan to 1/4 of an inch, it will change all of the annotation, sort of like a scale factor in AutoCAD, to adjust here the annotation for that scale. If you want to change one of the properties inside of a dimension, you can select it, and based on what we said in the last few weeks, we have several styles of different walls, windows, doors, and here even dimensions that we can modify. So for this dimension, you can pick Edit Type, for example, and before you start changing any of the defaults that come with Revit, I would suggest that you duplicate and continue duplicating those defaults so that you have them as a base, so that you can create a new one and then changing, for instance, the tick mark size and some of the other parameters of the dimension style. We can also place a room tag. So in the Architecture tab, we can click on Room, and then just go into one of your rooms with your pointer and left click. And then place another room here, tag, a room tag, which will now give it volume, and later on we'll be able to use it in our presentations. So to change the name, just select the room tag and click right on the word room and then change the name. For this style of tag, if you select it, you can go to Edit Type and put a check mark in Area and pick OK. So now all of your rooms will show also an area. We'll come back to using these room tags for presentation techniques we'll talk about next week, and to create schedules. Let's take a look at the site plan. If you double click over here on Site, the first thing you'll notice is that these elevation markers are very close to the building. These elevation markers define what is showing in the elevations. So make sure that if you want that part of the building to show, it's within these elevation markers. You can select one, hold your left mouse button down, and drag it out to give us a little bit more room for placing the topography. So select here this elevation mark just by crossing over the whole thing, and drag your mouse out and let go. And now we're ready. We can go to the Massing and Site tab and do a quick site plan. We'll click on Topography, and then notice here that the elevation is by default 0. So we can start to place points to create our topography. Now, don't exit the command, but while you're still in it, I haven't selected anything, I can change the elevation to a -6 inches, for example, and then continue to pick here around that contour line to create the next topography, and then change it again, maybe -1 foot or 12 inches, and continue. When you're done creating these, and we'll come back to different ways of creating topography with imported files, let's go ahead and pick the green check mark. Now we can place some of our site components. We can go ahead and click on Site Component. There are a few trees here that come loaded already underneath these deciduous trees. So let's go ahead and place a few in our site plan, and notice as you're placing them, you can see the distance. There are several ways of showing different surfaces on your site plan and even in your floors. And one way for the site is to use split surface. Split surface will actually split the surface and make those two surfaces two different elements. The subregions will help you to control the surface itself and is a little bit better for defining sidewalks and materials that are on the surface. So let's go ahead and pick subregion, and for now we'll keep it simple, but like I said, next week we're going to render and add a few more details. So we'll go ahead and pick a rectangle and place here what could be a swimming pool. If you do use something like a spline to create curves, make sure that the end of the spline that connects the two ends is a separate line, or you may have gaps depending on what version of Revit you have. So I'll go ahead and pick the green check mark, and now it is its own distinct area. Let's go to the 3D view, and in the 3D view, if you're going to define rendering tools and create a presentation, you'll want to highlight 3D for the 3D view, right click and pick Duplicate View, and then duplicate. Duplicate won't take with it all of the annotation. So if this was a floor plan that had a lot of annotation, text, dimensions, you'd want to duplicate with the detailing. So here we'll pick duplicate view, duplicate, highlight copy of 3D, right click and pick rename. We're going to rename this one as 3D site plan, view, and pick OK. Now we can select this small rectangle that we created as a separate surface, and in the properties you'll see material. This is an introduction to using materials. Next week we'll take a look at rendering and get back to this material editor. So select by category. Here there's a small icon. Do a search for water or liquid, it's under. And in this file, we don't have it loaded. See, here are the materials that are in the document. But down here under the Autodesk materials and AEC materials, there's a material here. We can double click on it so that it is loaded into this file. And then when we double click on the one that's in the file right here, since we have that rectangle selected, we can take a look at some of these properties. The graphics are going to be what you see when you have shading on, and the appearance is more about when we render. So under graphics, under water graphics, if we want to change the shading or the color, we can click on color and choose any one of these colors. Go ahead and pick OK, and then pick done, apply, and OK. Let's do the same thing with the grass. So you can pick on the edge of the topography here, and then go to material and do a search for grass. You'll find the grass material, double click, and then double click on the one that's in the document. So for this selected topography, we can change the graphics for it to a different color by selecting here color under shading. And this is just for the shading graphics. So I can pick a different color, pick OK. And notice if I click on appearance, you'll see that there is already a rendered appearance defined. We can change the highlights and some of those things when we take a look at rendering. Let's go ahead and pick done and apply this and pick OK. And you'll see that you have the colors defined here under shading. Before we render next week, I wanted to show you this visual style called realistic. If you, at the bottom left corner, if you click here and pick realistic, you'll see that everything is grayed out still. And that's because we're using this transparency. If I turn the transparency off by going here to the visual display menu and picking graphic display options and going back to 0 for the transparency and apply, you'll be able to see a view that's similar to rendering but not as defined. So for instance here now I can see this tree and at least some of the coloring of the grass. And if I select this wall, I'm just going to rest my pointer here and tab until I get this outside wall here and click, and then I'll show you by changing this wall to maybe an exterior brick on metal stud to get a sense of what it will look like when it is rendered. So go ahead and change those few things in this assignment to practice. And the last tool I'd like to show you this week is the section box. If you put a check mark in section box, and this is only for this view, you'll see that the section box is really a controlled box on what you want to view. So you can select here this box and pick inside these little blue triangular grips and create a view that's cropped. So you can crop just the site, or you can actually create a section through your building. And we'll come back to that when we talk about presentations. So for now, I'm going to crop the site, and it makes for a nice model. Hold the shift key down and the wheel of your mouse and take a look at your model. Now if you take the check mark out of section box, your defined section will disappear. So you'll need to type in VG for visibility graphics, or in properties you can go to visibility graphics by clicking the edit button. Go to the annotation category, scroll down to section boxes, take the check mark out, pick apply, and pick OK.